My father never sold a product. He sold something far more dangerous, the aftermath of every choice, the echo of every sin. From the white powder that numbs the soul to a red market where life itself is a price tag, my inheritance was built on fine china while the cellar beneath rotted with secrets. I grew up hearing the clink of crystal goblets and the distant drip of water in a dark tunnel, a lullaby of luxury and decay. It felt like a beautiful nightmare, a story you might dismiss as fiction, but it is my reality, and I'm about to pull back the curtain. I was born into a family that didn't merely move merchandise, we moved futures. My father started as a small-time smuggler, slipping packets across borders, but he quickly realized that the real profit lay not in the product itself, but in the leverage that followed. He began offering protection, intimidation, the promise that once you crossed us, the consequences would follow you forever. That was the moment the empire shifted from selling a substance to selling the weight of fear. It was a simple equation. A product gives an immediate high, a consequence gives a lasting grip. He taught us that we were not dealers, we were architects of inevitability. When I was a child, I sat at a heavy oak table while my father polished a crystal goblet, his hands steady, his eyes distant. He would speak in low tones about the future we are shaping as the cellar door creaked open, revealing rows of barrels and crates that smelled of damp earth and rot. It told me that the world needed more than a fleeting escape. It needed a permanent reminder that every action has a price. That lesson settled into my bones the night a courier slipped a sack of white powder onto the back porch. The dust was fine as snow, shimmering in the streetlight, and it represented the first tangible piece of the legacy I was expected to carry. The white powder is more than a drug. It is a veil that blanks the mind, a temporary eraser of pain that leaves a deeper void in its wake. People who inhale it feel a fleeting lift, a sensation that everything else has faded. But the aftermath is a hollowed existence, a soul that no longer feels the sting of loss or the warmth of joy. I watched the young man, eyes glazed, describing the emptiness as if it were a physical space he could walk into. Beside the high was like stepping into a room with no doors, and when it faded, the walls collapsed, leaving him in a dark hallway of his own making. Then there is the red market, a network that trades in blood, organs, even whole lives. It is mapped out in veins of crimson on a black table, each line pulsing like a heartbeat. In that market, a child's laughter can be bartered for a donor heart, a politician's silence bought with a single drop of blood. The transactions are swift, the contracts sealed with a whisper and a scar. I have seen ledgers stained with rust, where the numbers are not dollars but names, dates, and the weight of a human being. It is a paradox that we celebrate with champagne on porcelain, while the cellar below fills with the scent of decay. I remember the first time I was asked to deliver a shipment of that white dust to a client who promised a future in exchange for a present indulgence. The weight of the sack in my hands felt like the weight of the empire itself, pressing down on my shoulders, reminding me that I was not just a courier, but a conduit for consequences. My father watched from the balcony, his silhouette framed by the flickering neon sign that read, "Consequences," and he nodded as if approving a rite of passage. In that moment, I realized that my role was not optional. It was predetermined, a piece of a puzzle that had been assembled long before I could speak. That dichotomy between luxury and rot is the core of this life. I have dined on silverware polished to a mirror shine, while the cellar doors remain ajar, letting the stench of mold seep into the hallway. The contrast is obscene, a reminder that every glass of champagne is built upon a foundation of fear. Every laugh is echoing over a chorus of silent screams. This split reality is what keeps the empire alive, and it is why I am both the heir and the prisoner of a system that thrives on humanity's darkest impulses. Now, as I stand at the crossroads of continuing this legacy or breaking it, I feel the pressure of every decision made before me. The choice is not just about walking away from a throne of ash and glass. It is about deciding whether I become the nightmare that haunts others or the savior that finally dismantles the house of consequences. What do you think about a world built on such fragile foundations? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear your perspective. If this story is resonating with you, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that this truth matters. And if you feel that this hidden economy of fear deserves more light, hit subscribe and join me as we dig deeper into the shadows of power, legacy, and redemption. The journey is just beginning, and the next chapter will reveal the moment I chose which side of the nightmare to stand on. The fire in my chest was not the kind that burns the flesh. It was a cold ember that whispered every secret my father had ever buried in the walls of that mansion. I could feel the pulse of the building itself, a heart that beat in sync with the countless lives it had claimed, a rhythm that echoed through the marble corridors and slipped down into the damp cellar where the rot festered like an open wound. Each step I took on the polished floors reverberated with the weight of promises never kept and debts never forgiven. I remembered the night my father first taught me how to read the ledgers. The ink was a deep, almost black crimson, each line a vein of blood that charted the flow of lives bought and sold. He slid the thin sheet across the mahogany desk, his fingers trembling just enough to show the strain of holding an empire that fed on fear. "You see," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the numbers are not just figures. They are the shadows of men who have given up their futures for a moment's relief. The children who will never see the sunrise because someone else decided they were worth a price." I watched the candlelight dance on the paper, casting flickering silhouettes of the world he had built. And I felt both awe and revulsion at the same time. The white powder that had once seemed like a simple commodity now revealed its true nature. It was not merely a substance that dulled the senses. It was a conduit for surrender. When a man inhaled that fine snow, his mind emptied, his will eroded, and the space left behind became a fertile ground for the consequences my father sold. Those consequences were not just the immediate high, but the lingering emptiness that turned a person into a ghost, a pawn in a game that stretched far beyond the reach of any single life. I could picture the faces of those who had taken that first hit, their eyes glazing over as the world slipped away, and I wondered how many of those hollow stares were now reflected back at me from the mirrors that lined the hallway. The red market, as we called it in hushed tones, was a different beast altogether. It was the place where life was measured in drops of blood, and the value of a heartbeat could be negotiated in the same way one might barter for silk. A single vial could represent a child's future, an organ could be the ticket to a new life for someone else, and a contract sealed with blood could bind families for generations. I saw maps of the routes etched on the backs of old crates, lines that pulsed like veins across continents, each connection a promise that someone, somewhere would pay the price. The irony was bitter. We offered salvation to those desperate enough to accept it, while simultaneously feeding the very desperation that kept the cycle alive. It was in that darkness that I found a crack, a thin sliver of light that seemed almost accidental. A former lieutenant, his eyes haunted by years of violence, slipped me a folded piece of paper during a rare moment of quiet. The message was simple, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "You are not bound by blood, but by choice. The empire will crumble if you decided to walk away, but it will also rise higher if you become the blade that cuts through its heart." The ink was smeared as if written in haste, but the intention was clear. My father had built a palace of consequences, but the foundation was built on a fragile mix of fear and greed that could be shattered with a single decisive act. He spent nights wandering the corridors, listening to the distant hum of generators that kept the lights on, and the faint, almost imperceptible sighs that rose from the cellar. The scent of mold grew stronger each time I passed the heavy wooden doors, a reminder that beneath the glittering surface lay decay. In those moments, he imagined the faces of the people whose lives were tangled in our web. Mothers who sold their sons for a dose, fathers who turned a blind eye to the blood on their hands, children who grew up never knowing a world without the shadow of consequence. Their stories were stitched into the very fabric of the mansion, and each thread tugged at my conscience. The decision loomed like a storm on the horizon. To stay would mean inheriting not only the throne of ash and glass, but also the endless chorus of silent screams that resonated through the stone walls. To leave would mean abandoning a legacy that had defined my identity, stepping out into a world that would judge me for the sins of a father I never chose. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that the true power of a legacy is not in its continuation, but in the ability to rewrite its ending. I thought of the night I first held the crystal goblet, its surface flawless, reflecting a distorted image of myself. The goblet was a symbol of the elegance we cultivated, a facade that hid the rot beneath. If I were to pour that white powder into it, it would become a vessel of emptiness, a reminder that even the most beautiful objects could be used to carry poison. In that moment, I realized that the real choice was not about the glass or the cellar, but about what I would become when I lifted the goblet to my lips. Would I drink the bitterness of the empire, or would I set it down and walk away, letting the glass shatter on the floor as a signal that the old order had finally cracked? The night grew colder, and the rain hammered against the windows, each drop a tiny drumbeat that echoed the urgency of my thoughts. I could hear my father's footsteps on the balcony, his silhouette a dark outline against the neon sign that still flickered, spelling out consequences in a language only the night understood. He did not speak, but his presence was a heavy weight that pressed against my chest, reminding me that the path I chose would reverberate through every corner of our world. He turned to the camera as if someone were watching my every move, and I felt a sudden urge to share this turmoil with anyone who might be listening. If you have ever felt the pull of a family legacy that seems impossible to escape, or if you have stood at a crossroads where the stakes feel larger than life itself, I want to hear your story. What would you do if the weight of an empire rested on your shoulders? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes the act of speaking out can be the first step toward breaking a chain. The decision was made in a whisper, not in a shout. I slipped the crystal goblet onto the table and let it fall, the sound of it shattering echoing through the hall like a gunshot in a silent night. The shards glittered on the floor, catching the dim light, each fragment reflecting a different angle of the world I had known. In that instant, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as if the broken glass had also broken the invisible ties that bound me to the past. I walked down the marble stairs, past the doors that led to the cellar, and out into the storm. The rain soaked my clothes, washing away the dust of the white powder that had clung to my skin for so long. The city beyond the mansion was a maze of shadows and neon, a place where the same consequences were being sold in countless other hands. Yet, for the first time, I felt like I could see beyond the veil, like I could choose a different rhythm for my heart. The journey ahead is uncertain. I do not claim to have all the answers, nor do I pretend that walking away will erase the damage already done. But I have learned that the most powerful weapon against a system built on fear is the willingness to confront it, to expose its rot, and to choose a path that does not feed its darkness. If this story has resonated with you, if you feel that the hidden economies of terror deserve a light that reaches even the deepest corners, give this video a thumbs up. It tells the algorithm that this truth matters, and it lets me know that I am not alone in this fight. And if you think there are more layers to uncover, more shadows to illuminate, consider subscribing. Not because I need more followers, but because together we can keep digging, keep asking the hard questions, and perhaps, one day, rewrite the story of an empire built on consequences. The next chapter will show what happens when the broken glass meets the rain, when the hair becomes a catalyst for change, and when the nightmare either deepens or finally begins to dissolve. Stay with me, and let's see where this road leads.